Now, these are devastating and truly horrific allegations.
Have you ever wondered whether the biggest royal secrets are uncovered by journalists, historians, or even rival members of the royal family, or by the ordinary people who spend years quietly working behind palace walls? According to supporters of a growing royal narrative, one of the most controversial stories surrounding Queen Camilla did not begin with a newspaper investigation, a leaked document, or a former royal insider seeking publicity. Instead, it allegedly began with a young maid who entered royal service full of admiration and hope, believing she had secured the opportunity of a lifetime. What she reportedly witnessed over the following years would stay with her for 2 decades, hidden inside a private notebook, until one sleepless night when she finally decided the public deserved to hear her side of the story. Whether the allegations are true remains impossible to independently verify, but according to supporters of the narrative, the account raises troubling questions about what life may really be like behind the grand doors of Britain's most famous palaces. According to the story, everything began in 2005. The year marked a major turning point for Camilla Parker Bowles. After years of public scrutiny, years of controversy, and years of intense media attention, she officially married Prince Charles and became Duchess of Cornwall. Many observers believed a difficult chapter of royal history had finally come to an end. Inside royal residences, however, supporters of the narrative claim that a very different story was beginning. According to the account, a 22-year-old woman named Emily Watson had recently joined the household staff assigned to assist Camilla. Coming from a modest working-class family outside London, Emily reportedly viewed the position as a dream opportunity. She was enthusiastic, hardworking, and eager to prove herself. Supporters of the narrative claim that she admired Camilla at first, seeing her as a resilient woman who had survived years of criticism before finally taking her place beside the future king. According to the story, Emily frequently told friends and family that she felt privileged to work inside one of the most famous households in the world. For a short time, everything seemed perfect. The routines were demanding. The expectations were high. But that was exactly what Emily had anticipated when entering royal service. She expected discipline, she expected precision, and she expected pressure. What she allegedly did not expect was fear. According to supporters of the narrative, the first incident that changed her perception of palace life appeared almost absurdly small. One morning, after working a late shift the previous evening, Emily prepared Camilla's breakfast tea according to strict household protocol. Every detail reportedly mattered. The tray had to be arranged correctly. The porcelain cup had to face a specific direction. And every item needed to be positioned precisely. Exhausted from lack of sleep, Emily allegedly made a tiny mistake. The teacup was placed slightly off-center, reportedly by less than a few centimeters. To most people, the difference would have been impossible to notice. According to the narrative, however, Camilla noticed immediately. What happened next would reportedly stay with Emily for years. According to the story, Camilla did not shout, she did not throw the cup, and she did not create a public scene. Instead, she allegedly delivered a calm but devastating criticism. A criticism that supporters of the narrative claim left the young maid humiliated and in tears. According to the account, Camilla questioned whether someone incapable of arranging a tea tray correctly belonged in royal service at all. The words themselves may not have seemed extraordinary when written on paper. Yet supporters of the narrative argue that the manner in which they were delivered made the experience unforgettable. Emily allegedly felt as though every mistake she had ever made was being exposed and judged at once. By the time the exchange ended, she was reportedly struggling to hold back tears while continuing her duties as if nothing had happened. According to supporters of the story, what shocked Emily most was the reaction of other staff members. Nobody appeared surprised, nobody rushed to comfort her, and nobody questioned what had happened. Instead, several colleagues simply lowered their eyes and returned to work, as though they had seen similar situations before. According to the narrative, it was only later that Emily began hearing whispers from long-serving staff. Some allegedly described Camilla as someone who rarely raised her voice but possessed an ability to make employees feel deeply uncomfortable through criticism, disappointment, and subtle displays of authority. Supporters of the narrative claim that workers often feared making even the smallest mistakes because they worried about becoming the focus of similar remarks. Whether those fears were justified remains impossible to determine. Yet according to the story, the atmosphere of anxiety became increasingly noticeable as Emily spent more time inside the household. What makes this chapter particularly important is that it allegedly marked the beginning of a transformation. Emily entered the palace feeling excited, confident, and proud, but supporters of the narrative claim that she gradually became someone very different. Someone who checked every task repeatedly, someone who worried constantly about making mistakes, and someone who began documenting events in a private notebook because she feared she might one day forget what she had experienced. According to the story, the notebook started with simple observations, dates, incidents, conversations, small details that seemed insignificant at the time. Yet over the months that followed, the entries allegedly became longer, more detailed, and increasingly troubling. And according to supporters of the narrative, the incidents that inspired those entries were only beginning. Because as Camilla's influence within the royal family continued to grow, Emily would allegedly witness events that made a misplaced teacup seem completely insignificant by comparison. According to supporters of the narrative, the atmosphere inside Clarence's house allegedly changed dramatically as Camilla's position within the royal family became more secure, because while the public increasingly saw a composed and confident Duchess of Cornwall appearing beside Prince Charles at official engagements and charitable events, staff members working behind the scenes reportedly faced growing pressure to meet standards that seemed to become more demanding with each passing month. And Emily Watson, who had once entered royal service with excitement and admiration, allegedly found herself struggling to adapt to an environment where even the smallest detail could suddenly become the center of intense scrutiny. According to the story, by 2007, Emily had been working within Camilla's household long enough to understand the routines, expectations, and unwritten rules that governed daily life behind palace walls, yet despite her growing experience, she allegedly never became comfortable. Because the fear of making a mistake remained constant, and the memory of her humiliating encounter involving the misplaced teacup continued lingering in her mind long after the incident itself had passed. Supporters of the narrative claim that many members of the household eventually developed similar habits, repeatedly checking their work, questioning every decision, and worrying that a minor oversight might trigger another uncomfortable confrontation. What makes this stage of the narrative particularly significant is that the pressure allegedly expanded beyond routine household duties and began affecting major royal events. Not private dinners, not ordinary meetings, but high-profile occasions involving hundreds of guests, events that required months of preparation, events where a single change could create enormous consequences for dozens of employees. According to supporters of the story, one such occasion arrived during the autumn of 2007 when preparations were underway for a major charity gala intended to support children's causes and attended by distinguished guests from across Britain and beyond. The event had reportedly been planned for weeks. Floral arrangements had been approved, decorations had been finalized, menus had been carefully prepared, and according to the narrative, staff members believed everything was ready. Then, only a few hours before guests were scheduled to arrive, Camilla allegedly entered the venue and decided that almost everything needed to change. According to supporters of the narrative, the announcement stunned everyone present because the event was already nearing completion, yet Camilla reportedly expressed dissatisfaction with multiple aspects of the presentation, allegedly ordering staff to replace floral displays, alter table settings, change decorative themes, and even revise portions of the menu despite the extremely limited time available before the reception was due to begin. What made the situation particularly difficult, supporters of the story claim, was that many of the elements she wanted replaced had previously received approval, meaning employees suddenly found themselves dismantling work they had spent weeks perfecting while racing against the clock to implement an entirely new vision. The atmosphere reportedly became frantic. Staff ran between storage rooms and banquet halls. Decorations were removed. New materials were brought in. Kitchen teams revised dishes, and supervisors struggled to coordinate dozens of exhausted employees attempting to complete hours of work in a matter of minutes. According to the narrative, nobody felt able to object. Nobody felt able to suggest waiting until a future event. And nobody wanted to risk becoming the focus of criticism. According to many supporters of the story, Emily found the experience especially disturbing because it allegedly revealed a growing gap between what the public saw and what staff members experienced behind the scenes. Guests arriving that evening reportedly admired the elegant decorations, praised the sophisticated atmosphere, and complimented Camilla's attention to detail, completely unaware that dozens of workers had spent the previous hours scrambling under intense pressure to transform the entire event at the last possible moment. From the outside, everything appeared flawless. Inside the operation, however, supporters of the narrative claimed that exhaustion and frustration were widespread. What affected Emily most was not the workload itself. Royal service had always required hard work, long hours, and extraordinary commitment. Instead, it was the feeling that the effort had become invisible, that the sacrifices being made by staff no longer mattered, and that their well-being carried little weight compared to maintaining a perfect public image. According to supporters of the narrative, the gala became a turning point because it allegedly convinced Emily that the incidents she had experienced since joining the household were not isolated misunderstandings, but part of a larger pattern. The pressure, the criticism, the constant fear of mistakes, and the willingness to impose dramatic last-minute changes regardless of the burden placed on employees all appeared connected. As a result, supporters of the story claim that Emily began documenting events more carefully than ever before. Her private notebook, which had started as a simple record of unusual incidents, reportedly evolved into a detailed account of daily life behind palace doors. According to the narrative, each entry became more personal, more detailed, and more emotional. Emily allegedly recorded conversations, descriptions of events, and her own reactions to what she witnessed. Not because she planned to publish anything, not because she expected anyone else to read it, but because writing became the only way she could make sense of an environment that increasingly left her anxious and uncertain about the future. Supporters of the story argue that the notebook gradually transformed into something far more important than a diary. It became a private archive of experiences that Emily feared would otherwise be forgotten. And according to the narrative, that archive would soon become invaluable because the most dramatic chapter of her time inside the royal household had not yet arrived. A mysterious missing document, a palace-wide lockdown, and a series of interrogations were about to plunge the staff into a level of fear unlike anything they had experienced before, forcing Emily to confront questions about loyalty, trust, and survival that would ultimately shape the rest of her life. According to supporters of the narrative, the atmosphere inside the palace allegedly changed completely after the mysterious envelope incident, because while the missing document had eventually been found and no evidence of theft had ever emerged, the experience reportedly left behind something perhaps even more damaging, a culture of suspicion that slowly spread throughout the household, causing staff members who had once worked together comfortably to begin viewing one another with caution, uncertainty, and fear. For Emily Watson, who had already spent several years coping with what she described in her private notes as constant pressure and emotional strain, the episode allegedly marked the moment when she realized that life inside the royal household had become something very different from the dream she had imagined when she first accepted the job. According to the story, employees stopped speaking as freely as they once had. Conversations became shorter, trust became weaker, and simple workplace frustrations increasingly remained unspoken. Nobody wanted attention, nobody wanted conflict, and most importantly, nobody wanted to become the next person placed under scrutiny. Supporters of the narrative claimed that the envelope investigation had demonstrated how quickly an ordinary employee could find themselves facing uncomfortable questions, and many staff members allegedly concluded that staying invisible was the safest strategy available. According to many commentators following the narrative, the strain became particularly visible among younger members of the household staff who had not yet developed the emotional resilience possessed by more experienced employees. One of those individuals was reportedly Sarah Thompson, a 25-year-old staff member known for her energy, confidence, and willingness to say what others preferred to keep private. Unlike many of her colleagues, Sarah allegedly struggled to hide her frustration when schedules changed unexpectedly, when last-minute demands created unnecessary pressure, or when employees were expected to absorb criticism without complaint. Supporters of the story claim that while others learned to remain silent, Sarah continued asking questions. What made Sarah different was not that she disliked her work. She worked hard, she fulfilled her responsibilities, and she reportedly cared deeply about doing her job well. But according to supporters of the narrative, she believed there should be limits. Limits to exhaustion, limits to pressure, and limits to what employees should be expected to tolerate. According to the story, Sarah occasionally expressed these frustrations in staff areas after difficult shifts, particularly following evenings when sudden changes created additional workloads for employees already working long hours. At first, her complaints reportedly remained private. She would vent to colleagues, question decisions, and joke about the impossible standards expected from staff. Yet supporters of the narrative claim that over time her comments became more direct, more frequent, and increasingly difficult for management to ignore. According to many observers, Emily watched these developments with growing concern. Not because she disagreed with Sarah. In fact, supporters of the story suggest she privately sympathized with many of her concerns. But Emily had already learned a lesson that Sarah had not. Inside the palace, drawing attention to yourself could carry consequences, and those consequences were often impossible to predict. According to the narrative, the defining moment arrived during the summer of 2008. Employees reported for work as usual. Duty rosters were posted. Assignments had been organized. Everything appeared normal. Then, several staff members allegedly noticed something unusual. Sarah Thompson's name was gone. Not moved to a different schedule. Not reassigned to another department. Gone entirely. Supporters of the story claim that colleagues immediately began asking questions, assuming there must be some explanation. Yet according to the narrative, clear answers never arrived. What happened next reportedly became one of the most discussed episodes in Emily's notebook. Sarah's locker was emptied, her assignments disappeared, and employees were allegedly discouraged from discussing the situation. Some people asked questions, others remained silent, but according to supporters of the narrative, the message felt unmistakable. Sarah was gone, and nobody wanted to become the next Sarah. According to many commentators, whether Sarah left voluntarily, was dismissed, or simply moved on to another opportunity remains impossible to verify. The narrative offers only Emily's perspective and the observations she allegedly recorded at the time. Yet supporters of the story argue that the uncertainty itself became part of the problem. Without clear communication, rumors flourished, speculation increased, and staff members reportedly became even more cautious about expressing dissatisfaction. For Emily, the experience allegedly had a profound effect. The envelope incident had created anxiety, but Sarah's disappearance created fear. Fear that speaking openly could carry risks. Fear that questioning authority might attract unwanted attention. And fear that years of hard work could disappear overnight without explanation. According to supporters of the narrative, this was the moment when Emily allegedly made one of the most important decisions of her life. She would leave, not immediately, not dramatically, and not through confrontation. Instead, she reportedly began quietly preparing for the end of her palace career while continuing to perform her duties as professionally as possible. At the same time, however, she became increasingly protective of the notebook she had been keeping for years. What had once been a personal diary was now something else entirely, a record of experiences she feared nobody would believe if she ever tried to describe them from memory. According to the story, Emily understood that taking such material with her carried risks. She could not openly remove documents. She could not take official records. And she could not leave with anything belonging to the palace. But her personal observations were different. The notebook belonged to her. The memories belonged to her. And the experiences belonged to her. Supporters of the narrative claim that before submitting her resignation, Emily carefully preserved the most important sections of her notes, ensuring that even if the original notebook were lost, the information would survive. She reportedly left the palace citing personal reasons and family circumstances, offering no public criticism and attracting little attention. To most people, she simply became another former employee moving on with her life. Yet according to the narrative, she left carrying something far more significant than anyone realized. Because hidden among those handwritten pages was a collection of memories that would remain silent for nearly 2 decades before unexpectedly resurfacing and reigniting questions about what may have happened behind palace doors all those years earlier. According to supporters of the narrative, Sarah Thompson's sudden disappearance allegedly marked the moment when fear fully replaced frustration inside the palace household. Because while employees had previously complained privately about pressure, long hours, and constantly changing expectations, Sarah's absence reportedly sent a message that many staff members interpreted as a warning, causing conversations to become shorter, questions to disappear, and an atmosphere of silence to settle over areas that had once been filled with ordinary workplace chatter. For Emily Watson, who had already endured years of stress and uncertainty, the event allegedly became impossible to forget because it seemed to confirm her growing belief that speaking openly carried risks no employee could afford to take. According to the story, Sarah's departure was unusual not because employees never left royal service, but because of the way it allegedly happened. There was no farewell gathering, no explanation shared among colleagues, and no opportunity for staff members to say goodbye. One day her name appeared on schedules, the next day it did not. Supporters of the narrative claim that even employees who had worked closely with Sarah struggled to obtain answers, and when questions were raised they reportedly received brief responses encouraging them to focus on their own responsibilities rather than discussing former colleagues. According to many commentators following the narrative, this uncertainty proved more damaging than any official explanation might have been because employees were left to fill the gaps themselves, creating an environment where rumors spread rapidly and every unusual event became a potential source of anxiety. Emily allegedly found herself thinking constantly about Sarah's complaints, replaying conversations in her mind, and wondering whether her colleague had simply chosen to leave or whether something more complicated had occurred. Supporters of the story claim that the absence of clear information made the situation impossible to process, leaving many staff members feeling vulnerable and uncertain about their own futures. What affected Emily most was the realization that she had slowly become someone she barely recognized. The enthusiastic young woman who had entered royal service full of excitement was gone. In her place stood someone who carefully measured every word, someone who avoided attention whenever possible, and someone who increasingly viewed each workday as an obstacle to survive rather than an opportunity to embrace. According to supporters of the narrative, Emily eventually concluded that remaining inside the palace environment was no longer sustainable because the emotional toll had become too great. The pressure of maintaining perfection, the lingering memories of humiliating encounters, the fear created by investigations and accusations, and the uncertainty surrounding Sarah's disappearance had allegedly combined into a burden she could no longer ignore. Yet even as she prepared to leave, Emily reportedly understood that walking away would not automatically erase what she had experienced. According to the story, she began quietly planning her departure, not through confrontation, not through public accusations, and not through dramatic gestures. Instead, she continued performing her duties, continued following instructions, and continued maintaining the professional appearance expected of royal staff. But privately, a decision had already been made. Supporters of the narrative claim that before resigning, Emily became increasingly protective of the notebook she had been maintaining for years. What had started as a personal record of unusual incidents had gradually evolved into something much larger. The pages allegedly contained observations, dates, conversations, and emotional reflections documenting experiences she feared nobody would believe if she ever attempted to recount them from memory. According to the story, Emily viewed the notebook not as evidence against anyone, but as a safeguard against forgetting the reality she believed she had witnessed. What makes this chapter especially significant is the care Emily reportedly took before leaving. She allegedly understood that taking official materials would be inappropriate. She allegedly understood that palace documents belonged to the institution. And she allegedly understood that making public accusations could expose her to serious consequences. For that reason, supporters of the narrative claim she focused only on preserving her own recollections. Nothing more, nothing less. According to many commentators, Emily eventually submitted her resignation citing personal and family reasons, a decision that attracted little attention beyond the immediate workplace. Employees leave organizations every day, and on the surface her departure appeared entirely ordinary. Supporters of the narrative argue that nobody realized she was leaving with years of memories carefully preserved in private notes and photographs. To the palace, she was simply another former employee moving on with her life. To herself, however, she was carrying a record of experiences she suspected would remain important someday. According to the story, Emily's departure marked the end of one chapter, but not the end of the story. The notebook remained hidden, the memories remained private, and the years passed. 1 year became 5, 5 became 10, and eventually nearly 2 decades slipped by. During that time, Camilla's public image continued evolving. Her role within the royal family expanded, and public acceptance gradually increased. Supporters of the narrative claim that while the world watched Camilla transform from a controversial figure into Queen Camilla, Emily watched from a distance, carrying memories that seemed increasingly disconnected from the public narrative surrounding the royal household. She built a new life, pursued ordinary work, and rarely discussed her palace years. Yet according to the story, she never discarded the notebook, she never destroyed the photographs, and she never completely escaped the feeling that one day she might have a responsibility to tell her side of the story. According to many observers, the most dramatic chapter was still ahead, because after 20 years of silence, a quiet life in the London suburbs, and countless nights spent wondering whether speaking out would achieve anything at all, Emily would allegedly make a decision that changed everything. One late night, sitting alone with the notebook that had followed her for 2 decades, she would reportedly open a computer, create an anonymous account, and publish a detailed account of her experiences. And according to supporters of the narrative, the reaction that followed would spread far beyond anything she could have imagined, turning a forgotten notebook into the center of a controversy that suddenly placed Queen Camilla under intense public scrutiny once again. According to supporters of the narrative, the final chapter of the story allegedly began the moment William realized that the investigation was no longer simply about identifying who had frightened Charlotte. It had become a test of responsibility, loyalty, and the difficult choices that come with protecting the future of the monarchy. For weeks, William and Catherine had reportedly focused on gathering facts, avoiding speculation, and ensuring that every allegation was examined carefully. But according to the narrative, once investigators believed they had assembled a complete picture of what had occurred, a far more painful question emerged. What should happen next? According to the story, William's reaction was shaped first and foremost by his role as a father. Before titles, before protocol, and before family politics, there was a child who had allegedly spent weeks living in fear. A child who no longer felt completely safe in her own room. And a child whose trust had reportedly been damaged by people she believed were there to protect her. Supporters of the narrative argue that this reality left William with little room for compromise. Whatever decisions followed, they claim, would be guided by Charlotte's well-being above all else. According to many commentators, this is where the controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan's children allegedly entered the discussion. Within the narrative, senior royal advisors reportedly began reviewing long-term arrangements connected to future financial support, ceremonial privileges, and the broader relationship between the Sussex family and the institution. Supporters of a story argue that these conversations were not presented as punishment directed toward children, but rather as part of a wider reassessment of family relationships after trust had allegedly been damaged. Whether such discussions ever occurred remains unverified. However, within the narrative, they became the symbolic consequence of the crisis. What makes this stage particularly emotional is William's alleged internal conflict. According to supporters of the story, he was not confronting a stranger. He was confronting the possibility of a permanent fracture with his own brother. Years earlier, few people could have imagined such a situation. The two princes had shared childhood experiences unlike anyone else in the world. They had endured public scrutiny together. They had mourned their mother together, and they had once appeared inseparable. According to the narrative, that history made the situation especially painful because every decision carried consequences extending far beyond the immediate investigation. According to many royal observers, Catherine remained focused on a different priority throughout the process. While questions about royal relationships dominated public speculation, supporters of the narrative claim that Catherine concentrated on helping Charlotte recover emotionally. The alleged investigation may have uncovered answers, but answers alone could not erase fear. According to the story, Catherine spent significant time reassuring her daughter, rebuilding her confidence, and ensuring that she understood she had done nothing wrong by speaking up. Supporters of the narrative argue that this became one of the most important lessons of the entire episode. What makes the ending especially powerful is that Charlotte allegedly emerged stronger from the experience. The fear gradually faded, the uncertainty gradually disappeared, and the sense of security that had been shaken slowly returned. According to supporters of the story, seeing that recovery reinforced William and Catherine's belief that they had made the correct decisions, regardless of how difficult those decisions may have been. For them, protecting their children came first. Everything else came second. According to many commentators, the broader significance of the narrative lies in its portrayal of duty. The story presents William as a future king forced to place responsibility above personal emotion, even when doing so involves people he once loved and trusted. Supporters of the narrative argue that this theme resonates because it reflects one of the oldest challenges in royal history, the tension between family loyalty and institutional responsibility. When those two obligations collide, difficult choices become unavoidable. According to the narrative, the ultimate lesson is not about scandal. It is not about revenge. And it is not about palace intrigue. It is about trust. Once trust is broken, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult, whether between parents and staff, between brothers, or between members of one of the world's most famous families. Supporters of the story argue that this is why the alleged events continue attracting attention. At its heart, the narrative revolves around universal themes that people everywhere understand: protecting children, defending family, and making difficult decisions when those you care about appear connected to painful circumstances. As the story concludes, supporters of the narrative claim that William's priority remained unchanged from the very beginning. Not titles, not headlines, and not public opinion. His focus was allegedly the safety and happiness of his family. And according to many commentators, that commitment ultimately defined every decision that followed, shaping the outcome of the crisis and reinforcing the image of a future king determined to place duty above everything else. So what do you think? If you were in William's position, would protecting your child come before preserving family relationships? Or should every effort be made to keep the family united regardless of the circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest coverage of Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, and the ongoing story surrounding the British royal family. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.